Okay, here we go. Chapter 4 of Why Race Matters. I've got about a quarter of this chapter highlighted. Just the juicy bits. But, as always, you're free to check out the link in the description for the full text. Once again, I'm not trying to hide anything. It's just some of the stuff is very technical, very statistical, and frankly, boring. I'm going through the boring parts so you don't have to. I'm trying to make this presentation all killer, no filler. Not that the other stuff is filler, but it's tedious. Alright, so, Chapter 4, Genetic Factors. What is a gene? As the cause of race differences proves to be morally pivotal, it is important to estimate the extent to which genes are involved. The idea of a trait being due to genes is said to be problematic, primarily because genes by themselves are inert. Environment always mediates the expression of a gene, however near its expression a gene may be. A height gene produces one phenotypic height with one diet, another height with another diet. Not that dependence on environment is unique to genetic causation. Rubber melts if heated to 400 degrees Celsius, and it shatters when struck if cooled to negative 200 degrees Celsius. Neither genes nor chunks of rubber have causal powers in and of themselves. Still, there is widespread mistrust of explanations using genetic factors, with some writers cautioning so emphatically that all phenotypes are the joint product of genes and environment as to imply the two are inseparable. Yet the causal role of genes can be isolated, as can the role of any single reactant in a chemical process. Following a tradition that identifies things with their causal powers, we may identify a gene, or more generally a genotype, with its capacity to produce different phenotypes in different environments. The proposal, in other words, is that a gene or genotype is what is usually called its range or norm of reaction. The dependence of phenotypes on both genes and environments undercuts a common argument against genetic accounts of race differences. It is observed that some aspect of black behavior, criminality for instance, has changed appreciably over a period, from 1930 to 1990 say, too short to permit genetic change, from which it is inferred that the cause of the race difference is that behavior is environmental. This is a non sequitur. The question of individual or group differences is not whether environmental variation can alter a phenotype, which it plainly can, but whether two individuals or groups exposed to the same environmental variation react to it similarly. If their reactions diverge, then, while a change in environment may explain the change in the phenotype of each, the phenotypic difference between them remains genetic in origin. It is pertinent in this connection that in recent times the most marked changes in black behavior have been away from white averages, while accompanying environmental changes have brought black environments closer to the white. Black criminality has increased, yet blacks and whites are treated more similarly now by the criminal justice system than 60 years ago. It's almost like treating them differently was necessary. This divergence of black and white behavior as environments have converged implicates genetic diversity. A shift in environment, not in genes, is the most probable trigger of these changes in black criminality, but the change is such as to suggest an underlying innate race difference. Diversity of environments can not only create the illusion of genetic differences where none exist, it can mask genuine genetic differences. It is irrelevant that there might be common environments in which black and white criminality also converge. So long as blacks become less like whites as there is convergence to some single environment, the races must differ genetically. Gene-environment correlation. Genes do not produce phenotypes merely by producing enzymes, which produce proteins, which then form tissues, ultimately forming organisms. Genes influence phenotypes indirectly, through expression as the ability to affect the environments in which the organisms develop. The ability of men to fly faster than birds seems at first environmental in origin, since humans outfly birds by taking airplanes, not by flapping stronger wings. but the airplane is a product of human inventiveness, which exceeds that of birds. The ability to fly is genetic after all, in the sense that human genes make the human brains which make airplanes. Speaking more generally, it is no accident that certain genes, such as those of humans, regularly occur in certain environments, such as airline passenger seats. Genetic shaping of the environment is called genotype-environment correlation, usually divided into three types. A correlation is, quote, active, when a gene affects its environment via its own phenotypic expression. Someone genetically inclined to exercise may seek out environments already conducive to it, such as mountainous country, or construct a suitable environment by building a tennis court. The human genotype airplane correlation is active. A correlation is passive when the gene that causes it is not a correlate. For instance, the genes of baby robins are usually found in nests because the genes of its parents program both reproduction and nest building. The hypothesis that genetically high IQ parents produce high IQ children and surround them with books says that the IQ status correlation is passive. Finally, a genotype environment correlation is termed reactive or evocative when the phenotypic expression of a gene causes others to modify their behavior toward the gene's bearer. The standard example is that of a child's innate curiosity prompting his parents to buy him a chemistry set. The particular kind of correlation in this example might be called genotype environment feedback. The reaction caused by the phenotype so changes the phenotype that it elicits a further reaction. Feedback may be positive, amplifying the phenotype, provoking the reaction, as when encouraging a curious child stimulates his curiosity, which evokes more encouragement. Or it may be negative, dampening the phenotype. Many environmentalists maintain that race and academic performance form a negative loop, wherein race predicts poor grades because it lowers teacher expectation, which depresses performance, which lowers expectations further, and so on. The claim made in popular debate that the race difference in intelligence is genetic should be taken to mean that black and white children would not develop the same mean intelligence if raised in the same environment, and, perhaps, the stronger thesis that blacks would develop lower intelligence than identically raised whites in all practically possible environments. Hereditarianism is a convenient label for the latter view, and its denial, the claim that identically raised blacks and whites would develop identical mean intelligence, may be called environmentalism. This is certainly how environmentalists understand the distinction. Quote, "There is an easy rebuttal to research and reasoning based on racist assumptions. In simplest terms, it is the environmental answer. Of course, races differ in some outward respects, but despite more than a century of searching, we have no evidence that any one of those pools of race-based genes has a larger quotient of what we choose to call intelligence or organizational ability or creative capacities. If more members of some races end up doing better in some spheres, it is because more of them grew up in environments that prepared them for those endeavors. If members of other races had similar upbringings, they would display a similar distribution of success." End quote. How optimistic and delusional. The balance of this chapter tacks closely to empirical data and accepted statistical methods, but it is also important to keep in mind a broader perspective from which the influence of genes on intelligence and motivation seems undeniable. Everyone knows that, no matter what efforts are made, even if raised from birth in the most stimulating environment imaginable, a chicken cannot learn calculus. Therefore, the ability of humans to learn calculus cannot be due solely to differences in the environment in which humans and chickens develop, but must involve human and chicken genes. And once one grants that genes determine interspecific intelligence differences, by interspecific means interspecies, once one grants that genes determine interspecific intelligence differences, there is no clear point at which groups become so closely related that genes cannot be relevant to variation. People are not only smarter than chickens because of genes, they are smarter than chimpanzees for the same reason. Different breeds of dogs differ in intelligence, as judged by speed of learning. It seems arbitrary to declare that human groups cannot differ in intelligence for genetic reasons. The brain is a physical structure, and physical structures are controlled by genes. Whether an organism grows arms rather than wings, or short arms rather than long ones, plainly depends on its genes. So it would be ad hoc to deny that the kind of brain an organism develops depends on its genes. And everyone accepts the dependence of the functional capacities of an arm or brain on its physical properties. So once it is agreed that the difference between what your arm and mine can do is under genetic control, it becomes arbitrary to deny that differences in mental powers might also be genetically controlled. The premise of the popular objection that there is no specific gene for intelligence is likely true, but irrelevant to the issue of genetic influence. Most traits are polygenic, and a trait influenced by numerous genes will vary as each one does. That no single gene determines intelligence hardly makes genetic variation irrelevant. It is also objected that the precise manner in which genes produce intelligence is unknown, but a mechanism need not be identified to be known to exist. It does not take a chemist to realize that cars are fueled by gasoline, because cars stop when their gasoline runs out. In any case, this appeal to ignorance is becoming passé, as race differences in specific genes are being discovered. For instance, the A1 allele of the D2 dopamine receptor gene implicated in alcoholism occurs more frequently in blacks than whites. This gene is not known to bear on intelligence directly, but it marks a race difference at the molecular level with respect to an overt phenotype. Epstein et al. 1996 and Benjamin et al. Also 1996 have traced some variants in novelty seeking to a single gene site. The sample in Benjamin includes both blacks and whites, although whether the allele associated with greater novelty seeking was found more frequently in one race was not reported, and its authors have not responded to requests for further information. These heuristic arguments do not establish, and should not be expected to establish, that everything is genetic, but they do make it plausible that genes matter to intelligence and personality. Heritability. Genetic causation is not all or nothing. It is important theoretically, and, it turns out, morally, to say how much of the difference between two phenotypes is due to genes. Hereditarianism, then, predicts that some race differences in IQ would remain if blacks and whites were raised in an identical range of environments, the size of the difference indicating how much genes explain, while environmentalism predicts that the difference would vanish. Environmentalism, all of whose eggs are in a smaller basket, is more adventurous. Hereditarianism does not attribute all differences to genetic factors, although it is compatible with that outcome, whereas environmentalism does attribute all differences to environmental factors, not themselves correlated with genes. Environmentalism rules out any genetic contribution to the race difference, while hereditarianism allows environmental contributions. So basically, hereditarianism is open-minded because it's not saying that it's all genes. It's saying that it's partly genes, partly environment. We have a nuanced view. But so-called anti-racists, aka environmentalists, want to act like the only thing that matters is the environment. That's the only thing that affects any trait, including intelligence, which is pretty ridiculous.